every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Great.com is a philanthropic project where we're donating 100% of our profit towards the most effective cause areas like protecting the rainforest, funding climate change technology. If you want to help Great with the mission that we're doing, the best thing that you can do right now is to subscribe to the channel. And the topic of this talk today, this conversation is people power, how to mobilize people to add pressure to our political leaders. And to understand more about this, we've invited Kelly Stone from ActionAid. Someone say, Kelly, welcome to this interview.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kelly, help us understand what kind of problem do you see in the world and what kind of problem does ActionAid see in the world that you want to help solve?
Yeah, so ActionAid's an international network, and we work in over 50 countries to really try to end extreme poverty and help people realize their rights. And for right now, that means we do a lot of work on climate change. Climate change is a huge threat to communities all over the world right now who are losing land to sea level rise, to changing weather patterns with increased droughts and floods and superstorms. And so really, if we're going to build towards a more just society where people are able to realize their human rights, we have to be tackling climate change.
Just to see if I understand correct here, you could work just helping people in poverty with direct aid. What you're saying, climate change is so huge, such a big problem that we need to deal with that even more urgently than specific cause areas because climate change is going to affect everything else anyway. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, I mean, to talk about, let's say, food security and hunger, what ActionAid has worked for a long time is to make sure not just that people are getting food today, but that they have the means to ensure that their family will be fed reliably going forward. That's what we really mean by food security. But for today, when you're looking at the changes that we're already seeing in the climate, agriculture is really being impacted already in large parts of the world. So if we're going to be working to end hunger, if the climate keeps warming, that's just not going to be possible. So we really need to be focused on climate change today.
That completely resonates with my worldview as well. So help us understand the more specific details in the work that you're doing. How do you guys fit into the picture?
Yeah, so my organization, like I said, we're in 50 countries and we do a lot of kind of a bit of everything. So some of it is on the ground. We do work with communities to help them, to really support them in realizing their rights. So whether that's working on agroecology and resiliency projects, helping people organize to advocate for storm shelters for everyone in the community. But then also my organization, because we're based in the US, we do a lot of advocacy and organizing to make sure that the voices of the most vulnerable are really heard in the corridors of power. So we work with the communities on the ground and take those stories to the UN, to Congress, to the US administration to really advocate for the policies and programs that we need from the government.
This might be a hard question to answer, but let's see if it's possible. You're saying that you are trying to help to give more political arena for the groups that doesn't have so much voices. Could you help us understand which groups would that be and how big is the gap right now to the influence that they should have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the gap is massive. So if you look at like one really tangible example of this is for the Paris Agreement. This was being negotiated at the UN, and we ActionAid had a big contingent there, including some youth activists who were telling stories of their hometown. And I was talking to one of them who, his family was already losing its farmland because of sea level rise. And so he had already been forced to leave home to go to a nearby city to try to find work so he could support the rest of the family. And too often in the UN spaces, climate change is talked about like a future problem. And so what I worked with him to really tell his story, and so that I could bring his story into the rooms that sometimes he literally couldn't access. And then also for my organization, because we are globally focused, there are important aspects of the climate change response that we need the US to be doing, like climate finance, supporting the transformation we need in other parts of the world that, might not have the same natural constituency. President Biden's not going to meet someone on the campaign trail necessarily who's talking about the importance of the Green Climate Fund. But the Green Climate Fund is really important, and making sure that we're getting that climate finance funded is really critical to tackling climate change. So we try to bring in that international perspective.
That helps understand. This is more personal question. Are you worried personally that the people in power doesn't act soon enough?
Yes. I mean, I think we've already seen this, right? So we've seen inaction for decades. I mean, if you think about the original climate agreement, it was then years before, when the world originally came together in 1992 for the first climate agreement, the framework convention, it was then years before the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. And then, of course, the US withdrew. And then, of course, it was decades before we actually got the Paris Agreement. And so we've been just looking at literally decades and decades of inaction my entire life. And we've just run out of time to waste.
I completely agree upon that as well. US has withdrawn 2 times from an international agreement.
Yeah. And we're excited that President Biden has rejoined the Paris Agreement, but that's a first step. Like, that's the easy part. The hard part is going to be coming back to the international community with a commitment to act on climate that's actually in keeping with our fair share. So only if we do that and increase our ambition to really reflect our fair share, do I think we've got a chance of really jumpstarting this process again.
Help us understand, you're touching upon it, what needs to be done now. I guess there are different groups that can do different things. Could you highlight some groups in society that you really want to see action from, and what kind of actions would that be right now?
Yeah, so we're quite focused on the government. And so I think the next step that we want to see from President Biden is really action to actually match the ambition of the Paris Agreement goals. And so for us, that would mean putting forward a commitment of national action and backing it up with the domestic policy pieces to actually do what we'd call our fair share. Essentially, if you think about all the action that needs to happen on climate change, it's kind of a group project because we need all countries to be acting in coordination. And the only way to really ensure that is to make sure that each country is doing what their fair part is. And we'd say that's determined by how much their historical responsibility is, essentially how much they have emitted, how much of this mess they have made, and then also their capacity to act on it. And the US responsibility is extremely high, and we also have a lot of capacity. So for us, we'd say we have a huge fair share. We'd say it's about actually 195% reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. Now, that's a really big number, but what that actually indicates is that our fair share of the global effort is actually more than we could do inside our borders. So a big part of our fair share is not just the domestic work that we have to do to cut emissions here at home, but also supporting that kind of climate finance that I was talking about, so that other countries can do more than what their fair share is through this climate finance.
you're saying that America could not even do their fair share by themselves. They need to cooperate with other countries.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, we are the biggest historical emitter. We have a huge part of the responsibility for this problem. And we also have a huge capacity. We're a very rich country, despite the really shameful inequality here at home. And so, with all of that responsibility, even if we cut everything here tomorrow, which, we need to be reducing emissions here really aggressively, there's more that needs to be done. And so we should be supporting other countries. And for those countries, actually, their fair share essentially doesn't go far enough for what we need them to do in order to reach the Paris Agreement goals and limit warming to 1.5. So with our climate finance supporting them, they'd be able to do more than they would be able to otherwise.
Fun fact for the listeners, I read that the US are responsible historically for 25% of all the emissions, and China will be for 12.5%. So US has double the responsibility than China has emitted so far, even though it might seem like China is emitting more than anyone else right now.
Well, and it's important to think about the population too. China's population is considerably larger than the US population.
As well, right? Yeah. So what would happen then? Let's say the Biden administration would not take enough actions. What would ActionAid, what would be your counteract towards that right now?
Yeah. Well, I think what we've already seen is that, governments do respond to people pressure. And we've already seen this with President Biden. His climate plan has gotten considerably better over the space of the campaign and what he's been promising going into this first part of his administration is much more than what we saw at the beginning of his campaign. So we know that they are responding to people pressure. And so what we really need to do is organize with frontline communities here in the US and all around the world and really build that people power to demand that governments do this.
I read a report that right now it might be 10 times as high impact to do people pressure because of the new administration, that there's this wave coming where making an effort right now would make a lot of sense. So that's kind of what you're saying as well.
And I think this is going to be hard, and there's a lot of priorities right now that the Biden administration is facing. We are in a big mess, but things like COVID and the rebuilding that we have to do in our economy also presents an opportunity for us to tackle the climate crises. So, we should really be focusing on building back better. But it should be, that's what President Biden has been calling for. We need to build back better, but we need to keep in mind that, where we were when we started this with huge inequality and a growing climate crisis is not where we want to go. We should be building back a society that is really responsive to the needs of community and really supports people's human rights.
If we then go to, you're saying you can affect the people in power. How does that relate to normal people? What do you want the overall population to do right now?
Yeah. So, I think there's a lot of steps that folks can take, including from home, since a lot of us are stuck in some type of quarantine. Writing your member of Congress or whoever is your representative, writing the administration, signing petitions. ActionAid's got a petition running right now about doing our fair share of climate action. Things like that make a difference. Get to know your local representatives, attend town halls, follow the local meetings about that. Supporting frontline organizations and organizing organizations can also make a huge difference.
Thank you for the timestamp right now. What needs to be done regarding climate change? If we go back to ActionAid as an organization, is there anything else that you think is important to tell about the organization, the work that you're doing? Yeah,
thanks for the opportunity. So I think ActionAids, I think, is a really unique organization, is that we really work to try to be a bridge between frontline communities who are facing these kinds of threats every day, and give them a way to sort of bridge to get into these spaces of power, essentially. I think that we also take a unique approach in that we do the advocacy at the national and the international level, but we also have folks working on the ground in communities. And I think that that's a really important approach to actually seeing change, not just today, but realized going forward.
What could that look like if you're on the ground doing change?
Yeah, so we work in communities, and we make a point to make a long-term commitment. So we don't generally show up just for a short amount of time. We really work to make a long-term investment. And so, for example, I have seen our programs in Bangladesh that work with women farmers and communities to organize planning for emergencies, and then also to try to organize and band together to improve their selling power in the local market for their agriculture goods, and then also to teach each other different tools for farming to try to adapt to a warming climate and a rising sea level. I've also seen, and we do that work in places like Bangladesh, but also in places like Ghana, where we're working really with the local community so that they are articulating what they need, and we're supporting them in organizing amongst themselves. And that can mean at the local level, like I was talking about in Bangladesh, but it can also mean organizing to track budget spending from their local government to make sure that they're getting enough public financing for agriculture development and things like that. So we work at every level.
We're getting towards the end, and I have two questions. The first one is shifting direction a little bit, and I want you to summarize at the end. So I know that when I read on the website, there's quite much focus on women's right to power women, empower women. Would you say that because women doesn't have a strong position, is there any beliefs right now that are keeping women outside of power, which is also why we're in the situation that we are in climate change? Can we make any comparison or any? Do you see any comparison to women not having power and climate change being as it is?
So I think it's what I do think is that it gets back to that question about where the voices of marginalized communities are heard. And so too often women and other marginalized communities are excluded. And that means that, frankly, the needs of the people aren't being fully heard, and that therefore the government is maybe not responding in the way that it should. And so I do think that there's an important connection there about when we are shutting out large groups of people, and especially the vulnerable, we aren't hearing about the needs quickly enough, and that government's not then responding to them. So for any crisis, including climate change, is going to put the most stress on those who are already vulnerable. So women end up disproportionately bearing the brunt of the climate change that we're already seeing. And if more women were in places of power, I do think that there would be, that message would be heard better. But really, it's about that exclusion that becomes the problem.
A follow-up question before my last question. Is there any belief that you would like to break that keeps these groups outside of equality or justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this can happen in the development sector, is that there too easily there becomes this assumption that because someone is poor, because someone is marginalized, they don't know what they need. But actually, if you're talking to folks on the ground, like they may not be articulating it in a particularly technical fashion with lots of buzzwords or anything, but they understand what they need and they understand what the barriers are that are preventing them from getting there. And so, if we could do anything, I think, is recognizing that knowledge and really valuing it and empowering those communities to act on that knowledge, I think would go a long way to solving a lot of the problems that we're facing.
Thanks. That was quite a directed question. So I have some kind of agenda to just see hear what you are seeing, basically. So my last question is there anything that you want to empathize, that you want more people to really understand?
Yeah, I think that we can do this. We're already seeing really significant climate impacts globally, and that can get really scary. And it's easy to get lost in the technical discussions about how far and how fast can we go and what's politically possible versus not. But I think it's easy to distract ourselves in that when actually the work is realizing where we need to go and building the people power to get us there. And so that I guess is what the lasting impression I'd want to leave is that, we have a moment and it's too late to wait any longer. So we need to be building our power and holding governments accountable that we expect them to be acting on climate change. We expect them to be putting forward their fair share of climate efforts so that we can do this.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for taking the time, helping clarify the issue of climate change and the work that you guys are doing at ActionAid. If you want to go to the website, it's actionaid.org. Am I right?
Yep. And so actionaidusa.org is for ActionAid USA. That's my organization. We've got lots of information there about more details on the work that we're doing and how to help and how to donate.